talking about, I think we're looking at maybe 2 to 3 hours total of deliberation. I think they went back, they took a vote, and they had something close to a decision. Again, they might have all decided, yes, we buy what the defense's argument here, which is that Hunter Biden didn't understand himself to be an addict, that term is just too vague, and or he didn't think it applied to him when he signed that form. But again, a long way of saying, typically the jury comes back really quickly. The prosecution has to feel at least tepidly optimistic.
Rebecca, so the president's son is facing 3 felony counts of illegally possessing a gun while being a drug user and then making a false statement on this form. Could you see a split decision where he's found guilty of some of these crimes, but maybe not the one that has to do with the... Okay, we're going to be going to a special report shortly. So just to let you guys know, a verdict has been reached in the Hunter Biden case. We're going to take you to Delaware, where the court is starting to resume. But here's a special report.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in Washington, and we are coming on the air with breaking news from the federal gun trial of Hunter Biden, the first child of a sitting U.S. president to face criminal charges. We have just learned that the jury of 6 men and 6 women have reached a verdict after deliberating for roughly 3 hours over 2 days. We have learned that he has been found guilty on all 3 counts. Hunter Biden was charged with 2 felony counts for lying on a form, required to purchase a firearm in 2018. Then there was a 3rd charge, also a felony for being in possession of a firearm while abusing or being addicted to drugs. Our congressional correspondent, Scott McFarland, is outside the courthouse in Delaware. He has been following this case from the beginning with news on this verdict. Scott?
Nora, it didn't take this jury long. 1 hour of deliberation yesterday, 2 hours this morning. They come back guilty on all 3 counts for the president's son, which raises the prospect the president's son, Hunter, could face a prison sentence when this case goes to sentencing, likely later this year. The 3 charges all involved a gun he bought in October 2018, a gun the feds say he bought knowing he was a drug user, knowing he was addicted to drugs and therefore illegally, and for filing a false statement on the background check form when he didn't mark that he was a drug user or drug addict. The defense in this case, especially in closing arguments yesterday, tried to hinge its arguments that Hunter Biden may have been in recovery or getting sober in October 2018 and therefore didn't knowingly violate the law. That argument did not sway the 6-man, 6-woman jury from Wilmington, Delaware. And it's noteworthy, as Hunter Biden walked back in the courtroom a few moments ago, this day has been a singular day for Hunter Biden. In previous days, his whole family was here. The First Lady was here. His father, the president's sister, was here. Today, it's Hunter Biden in the courtroom learning his fate at the defense table with his attorney, Abby Lowell.
And Scott, let's talk about what Hunter Biden faces now. This is him walking in with his wife earlier today. My understanding is that each of the 3 counts has a maximum fine of $250,000 and that Biden faces up to 25 years in prison. But it's also my understanding that first-time offenders don't get anywhere near that. What do we know?
Yeah, the federal sentencing guidelines are going to be calibrated between now and the sentencing date. We're waiting to learn the sentencing date. We could find it out in a few moments. Could be early to mid-fall of this year. Federal sentencing guidelines will likely be calibrated to account for Hunter Biden having no criminal record, for having no federal felonies in his past, for a case that often gets pleaded out and doesn't go to trial. There'll be arguments by the defense and by the Department of Justice's special counsel as to what's an appropriate prison sentence. Then the same judge who heard this trial, Mary Ellen Noreika, a Trump appointee to the bench, will determine his fate at sentencing. But yeah, this is a federal firearms felony. It carries the risk or the prospect of prison time for the president's son at the end of what was the first ever criminal trial of a sitting president's child.
Scott McFarland, thank you. I want to bring in Major Garrett, our chief Washington correspondent. And Major, there's been a lot of focus on Hunter, tax evasion charges, and this in particular, now guilty on all 3 counts.
So, Nora, the last month in our country has been a conversation about application of justice. How high does it go? Can the high be brought down, brought low by the application of the law? And juries have decided that in not 1 but 2 cases, both unprecedented in our history. A former president being indicted,
Donald Trump,
convicted by a jury, and now the son of a president. And this question, is justice applied fairly? Is there political motives? Well, the White House and Democrats would argue, well, if you think that there is some sort of prosecutorial misconduct with Trump, look, the president's own son is in a federal courthouse, has now been found guilty by a jury of his peers. The broader application of this whole question will course through the presidential campaign. What is justice? How is it being applied? And is it being done in a way that is overtly political? Both sides will argue that, but now the country will see a former president and a sitting president's son both facing either probation or some kind of reckoning with the law.
From cases that really, or from alleged wrongdoing that dates back in this case with Hunter Biden to 2018. Also want to bring in Jan Crawford, our chief legal correspondent. What about that people have made the case that the law has been applied unequally to Donald Trump, and here the president's son convicted in Delaware, a state that it knows the Bidens quite well, Democratic state?
Well, I mean, I think there are a couple of parallels in both cases. They were both unusual prosecutions. In both cases, standalone charges, whether it was the business records hinging on this election law charge for former President Trump in New York, or here, a standalone charge owning and getting a gun if you're a drug addict without any other crimes bringing in here, whether it's a crime of violence with that gun. That's really unusual. I mean, those cases are very rarely prosecuted, as Major and Scott already have pointed out. So we have 2 cases with somewhat unusual prosecutions. We have 2 guilty verdicts, and now we're going to see 2 different types of appeals. And I think, Hunter Biden has some decent arguments on appeal. What's interesting is that he's going to find a greater reception with some of those judges on the appeals courts who were appointed by former President Trump. They have been much more sympathetic to arguments that some of these gun laws, like a felon or a drug addict being in possession of a gun, may violate the Second Amendment. He will make that argument eventually after he goes through some of his state court appeals.
It's interesting to note,
or his appeals of his trial, I mean.
Real quickly, that in a different era, both President Trump and Hunter Biden thought they were in the clear. Hunter Biden thought his attorneys had adjudicated this case and was all going to be handled.
Right.
And then this judge looked at it and said, no, I think this needs a closer look. There were times that other prosecutors looked at the Trump case and said, we're not going to carry that forward. And former President Trump thought, I'm in the clear. In both instances, people who are now rendered guilty thought they were in the clear, and they found out they were not.
I want to bring in CBS's Erica Brown because she has just come out of that courtroom where she witnessed Hunter Biden being read that verdict. And Erica, I know you've been in the courtroom for much of this trial. Tell us what you saw today.
Yeah, so as the jury filed into that courtroom, Hunter Biden, he stood up. He had his hands crossed in front of him, and then the courtroom deputy actually delivered the verdict. We didn't hear it from the foreperson or another member of the jury. So as that verdict was actually read by the courtroom deputy, Hunter Biden stayed seated with his attorneys next to him. He was looking directly at the courtroom deputy. He distributed very little emotion. We didn't notice anything major, just watching as each guilty their verdict came down. And then after the verdict was delivered, he touched both of his attorneys, hugged them. His wife behind him, after it was over, he hugged them. He hugged her, embraced her. So during this process, he exhibited very little emotion. For the most part, he was just paying attention, and then afterward, reaching over to both of his attorneys, Abby Lowell, David Kalansky, thanking them.
Erica Brown, thank you for that. I want to bring in Robert Costa, our chief campaign and election correspondent. And Robert, we've been through many unprecedented times with not only Joe Biden and Donald Trump, but now this presents a significant step for Hunter Biden in his recovery, as well as the president's reelection.
That's exactly right, Nora. Throughout American history, we've seen presidential family members run into trouble, whether it's Billy Carter or Roger Clinton. What makes the Hunter Biden situation and this conviction so different, based on my conversations with those very close to President Biden, is that Hunter is so close to the president. You think about the history they've shared together going back to late 1972, when Hunter's mother, Joe Biden's first wife, killed in a car accident, bonded Beau and Hunter to their father at that moment, closer than ever. And he has remained so close to the president while the President Biden has been in the White House, a fixture often inside the residence at the White House, on vacations, on flights with the president. And so when I talk to people close to Biden, they say this is a legal proceeding, but it's also a personal proceeding, that the president feels a lot of pain about the reckoning his son has dealt with addiction issues over the years. And he wants to be there for his son, even as he runs for re-election, deals with former President Trump and all of the issues throughout the world. People who know Biden say you really can't talk about how much Hunter's on the mind of the president every day.
If you know President Biden, he calls his children and his grandchildren every single day. He is a family man who stays very close with his kids. Let me ask you, though, Robert, recently President Biden gave an interview where he said he would not pardon Hunter Biden if convicted. And we will see if that position holds in the coming months. Pardons are something that can be discussed, deliberated. A position can change. For now, that is the president's position. But presidents often issue pardons to those who are close to them, those who they feel might deserve a second chance. So I don't rule out as a reporter that decision being reconsidered in the coming year or so. But at this time, the president is saying no pardon for his son. But that was before the conviction took place. And he was not asked, the president was not asked to follow up about whether he would commute Hunter Biden's sentence, which would also be an option under presidential powers. Let me also bring in Scott McFarland, who's there outside the courthouse. He has some more information about sentencing. What can you tell us, Scott?
Yeah, the judge said she is not going to set a firm sentencing date this moment, but estimated sentencing would be about 120 days from now. And that's usually the rhythm and pattern of the federal courts. It's about 3 to 4 months after a guilty verdict that a sentencing hearing is held. 120 days puts you right in the heart of October, right on the precipice of the election. We'll note that former President Trump has his sentencing just days before the Republican National Convention. Hunter Biden could have his sentencing just days before the election. And in the federal system, it's incredibly rare for a defendant to be immediately what they call stepped back, brought immediately to a federal prison facility. It would likely that Hunter Biden, if he were sentenced to prison, would have some lag time before he'd have to report, which could put that right at the precipice of the end of the term of this presidency. So you have a lot of variables at play as they go to sentencing. We'll add also from our team in the courtroom itself, the president's sister, Valerie Biden, stepped in just after the sentencing was announced. Jimmy Biden was there for the verdict. The First Lady of the United States was not here today. She was here, though, for 5 of the 6 days of trial.
Scott McFarland, thank you. Worth noting that Valerie Biden is not only the sister of the current President Joe Biden, but she is also the one who cared for Hunter and Beau after their mother was tragically killed in the car accident that Robert was talking about earlier. So she is very, very close with Hunter and the now deceased Beau Biden, the other president's son. I do want to bring in former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Tom Dupree. And Tom, it's likely Hunter Biden is going to appeal this verdict. And based on this case, what would be some of the grounds for appeal?
Well, I think one possible ground for appeal is a Second Amendment argument that he can basically argue.
Okay.
But when you look at this trial record, I don't really see a lot of other avenues for them to pursue. I thought the evidence was fairly overwhelming against them. And so the defense's best hope on appeal might lie in trying to persuade the Court of Appeals that this whole proceeding violated his right to bear arms.
And what would be the timing on that appeals process?
Well, it would be many months at a minimum. My guess is that if sentencing is imposed sometime, as Scott was reporting, in the fall, you would probably see an appeal get underway in 2025, but I wouldn't expect to get a decision from the Court of Appeals until sometime probably late next year, late 2025 would be looking at.
And Tom, what do you think were some of the key evidence for the prosecution?
Oh, where to begin? The prosecution had a mountain of all sorts of evidence. It really was a prosecutor's dream in terms of the breadth and the scope of the evidence that they brought to bear here. They certainly had very powerful testimony from witnesses, including people who were so close to Hunter Biden throughout his life, ex-wife, ex-girlfriend, his daughter, testifying about his struggles with addiction. The jury also saw documentary evidence, the forms in question that he filled out falsely. And of course, maybe the most powerful evidence of all was Hunter Biden's own words. The jury heard his voice resonating through the courtroom, reading from his autobiography, talking about his use of crack. They also saw his text messages again. But from the prosecutor's perspective, one of the most powerful pieces of evidence you can give to a jury is to confront the defendant with his own words. And the prosecution had no shortage of Hunter Biden's own words to use against him in this case.
And then, Tom, finally, as a former federal prosecutor, do you think Hunter Biden will go to prison?
I do. I think that the sentence here is not going to be unduly severe. This is he's effectively a first-time offender. I suspect that the judge will look somewhat sympathetically on this case. I don't see this as a case where the judge is going to be looking at an upper range of the sentencing guidelines. My sense is that the likeliest outcome would be a sentence of incarceration, but for a fairly limited period. We'd be talking a year or two, not 5 or 6.
And then, Tom, I referenced this earlier, and the president has not been asked this or ruled this out, but could President Biden commute that sentence?
Well, he could. And I know he said at least he's not planning to pardon Hunter Biden. But keep in mind, that's a promise made in May or June. And I suspect that the world will change between now and November. And President Biden may look at things very differently come November. So although, yes, the idea of a pardon or a commutation is off the table right now, I suspect it may come back with a vengeance after the election.
Tom, thank you. And just in case people don't know the difference between a pardon and a commutation, the president was asked specifically about a pardon, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
He was asked only about a pardon. And this brings us back to where we started.
And commute means to cut short, in other words, a sentence.
Ameliorate in some measure a prison sentence. But this brings us back, Nora, to where we started. From a political perspective, this is a clash of the legal system and political calculations. And everyone will see that. And the president will be under tremendous political pressure not to intervene in any way to say the law applies equally and to live by that in former President Trump's case, but also intimately so, possibly heartbreakingly so in the case of his son.
We are watching Hunter Biden leave the courtroom now. He does have Secret Service protection, and he is getting into one of those black SUVs there. I do want to bring in our political correspondent, Caitlin Huey-Burns, because she is at the White House. And Caitlin, we are expected to see the president in just a couple hours from now, correct?
Yes, that's right, Nora. He is here at the White House, but he is actually expected to speak later today on the topic of gun violence and what the administration has done to try to curb gun violence as well. He has not made any public statements about this news of the verdict. We have not heard from the White House or the Biden campaign. But I do want to remind our audience of statements that he has made in the past that give a window into his worldview on this case and the American justice system. Remember, on the day that the trial began, Biden issued a statement saying, "I am the president, but I am also a dad. As president, I don't and I won't comment on pending federal cases, but as a dad, I have boundless love for my son, confidence in him, and respect for his strength." As you also mentioned earlier, he had ruled out a pardon for his son in an interview last week. And when the Trump conviction came down, those 34 counts in the criminal case in New York, Biden also gave a statement saying that this is how the American justice system works. He said it's reckless, it's dangerous, and it's irresponsible for anyone to say this was rigged because they don't like the verdict. He also said that the American justice system is literally the cornerstone of democracy. It should be respected, and we should never let anyone tear it down. So as we await for his comments on this particular verdict, we have his comments about the verdict of his political rival and the American justice system.
All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns at the White House with that news that the President of the United States will be participating in a gun safety event along with Everytown shortly at the White House. We'll see if he makes remarks or is asked about that. Let's bring in Scott McFarland and Erica Brown one more time. They're outside the courthouse. Scott?
The First Lady arrived at this courthouse after the verdict was read. She was a late arrival as everybody was scrambling back to this courthouse. So she ended up being in the courthouse, but not there for the reading of the verdict. But she was there, front row, so prominent throughout this trial. And you'll note that the prosecution mentioned that in closing arguments.
That's right. At the very beginning of their closing arguments yesterday, federal prosecutor Leo Wise told jurors the people sitting in the gallery are not evidence because their presence was felt in that courtroom. They were in the direct line of view of jurors, and that jurors should only consider the evidence brought forth by the prosecution and Hunter Biden's defense attorneys.
And Nora, just noting here, the family tragedy that unfolded over 7 days that the First Lady watched play out. It was Hunter Biden's brother's widow testifying about his drug use, a woman with whom he had a romantic relationship. His ex-wife, his own daughter, describing, Nora, his descent into drug addiction and all the family relationships that broke apart along the way.
Yeah, Scott and Erica, you were inside the courtroom for much of that. What was it like?
Well, I will tell you, Nora, most people in the gallery were focused on that very first row behind Hunter Biden, looking at First Lady Jill Biden, looking at members of the Biden family to see how they would react to some of the evidence that the prosecution put forth. A lot of it, the prosecution acknowledged, was very personal, very ugly, very overwhelming, but in their own words, absolutely necessary to prove that Hunter Biden was a user of drugs and an addict during this period in which he purchased and kept that firearm for 11 days. And so you could hear a pin drop in certain instances when the prosecution presented evidence, especially when we heard Hunter Biden's own voice, when he read those excerpts from his book chronicling his drug use over a period of 4 years. And so people were attentive. Jurors were taking notes on large legal pads. At certain points, they were dozing off. But for the most part, they were attentive during those periods where they saw drug paraphernalia, images of drugs, videos of drugs on a scale, hearing Hunter Biden's own voice. But a lot of the attention, honestly, was in that very first row, looking at how the first family was responding and reacting to some of that evidence.
Erica Brown, Scott McFarland outside the courthouse. Thank you so much. Just to recap, Hunter Biden, the president's son, has been found guilty on all counts. He could face as much as 25 years in prison and fines up to $750,000, according to court filings. It is, according to prosecutors and other former Justice Department officials, probably unlikely that he would get that maximum penalty. But Tom Dupree, who served in the Justice Department, just told us he believes that Hunter Biden could, in fact, get some jail time, even as a first-time offender. This is serious for the president. It's serious for his son. Jan has noted there are legitimate grounds for an appeal, but this was also, I think, probably very difficult and emotional for the Biden family to relive, as any family would, someone who has battled through addiction in such a public way.
There's a scene in Hunter Biden's memoir that he's often talked about where his father and mother, Jill Biden, his late mother, of course, passed away in '72, invite him to come to the home, and they stage an intervention. And he runs down the driveway, and he says he just keeps running and running and running, back to drug addiction, back to conduct that's incorrect or unseemly. And he acknowledges this throughout his memoir, that his father tried to intervene, tried to bring him along to change his behavior. But he is someone who has dealt with issues for a long time. And for many families who have dealt with addiction, this is a story that's all too true, all too real. And it's now playing out for the first family. But President Biden's someone, I've seen him in Delaware. He always says the value of the Biden name. You know, take my word as a Biden. Now the Biden name is, in this trial, convicted. And for someone, those who know him say it hurts. It hurts.
But, you know, I think,
Go ahead, Jen.
I just think we have to remember, too, I mean, this is kind of the culmination of what is a really bizarre series of events that started in what was initially and widely believed to be Russian propaganda. and allegations of wrongdoing in Ukraine and dirty dealing by the president's son involving the president. This was a very narrow case that was ultimately brought. It had nothing to do with President Biden. It was solely focused on that drug addiction, that drug use, signing that form, and then possessing that weapon for those 11 days in October. And like I said, I mean, this is a rare case to bring, a standalone trial, a drug addict getting a gun and then possessing a gun. But they do get brought, and there has been jail time. And to what Tom DeBree said, perhaps there will be in this case. But I do think, going back, he will have grounds for appeal, potentially good grounds. And there's a Supreme Court case right now we're waiting on that could provide additional guidance on that as well.
Nor every presidential family is part of the American family. That's the way it works. This is a tragedy for the Biden family, precipitated in large measure by the death of Beau Biden, for 8 years the Attorney General of Delaware. Not the favored son, but the more prominent of the two sons. Hunter Biden's problems began to spiral, that is a word that is used in addiction therapy with some frequency, after Beau's death. He simply could not grapple with it. He made a ton of terrible decisions involving many members of the Biden family who had to find their way in, through, and out of this trial. That family drama played out in a courtroom in ways we have never seen before. It doesn't make it any less painful for the nation or for the family. But the verdict is now real, and the consequences will apply.
Want to bring in Scott McFarland and Erica Brown one more time, who are there outside the courthouse. What happens now?
There'll be a series of court filings, Nora, in advance of a sentencing hearing. And again, there's no firm date yet for the sentencing hearing, but the judge estimates 120 days, which is mid-October. So look in August and September for both sides to make their recommendation. Almost certainly the defense will recommend no prison time, a non-custodial sentence, they call it. They'll file their paperwork and their argument. The Department of Justice's special counsel, David Weiss, will file his recommendation, likely very late summer, potentially recommending a prison sentence. Then there is a hearing. There are arguments. Hunter Biden will be given the chance to speak and ask for leniency and ask for mercy before the judge, Mary Ellen Noreika, issues the sentence. But all of this could come in the footsteps of the 2024 election. The timing here is real.
All right, Erica Brown, thank you for all your reporting on this trial and being inside. Scott McFarland as well, thank you. Thanks to everyone here as well for your reporting and analysis. Once again, breaking news from Wilmington, Delaware. In the first ever trial of a sitting president's child, Hunter Biden is found guilty on all 3 counts in his federal gun case. The president's only surviving son was charged with 2 felonies of lying on a federal form required to purchase a firearm in 2018, and then a 3rd charge, also a felony, for being in possession of a firearm while abusing or being addicted to drugs. Hunter Biden facing up to 25 years in prison, but there is no sentencing date yet or set just yet, although Scott says it could come in about 3 to 4 months from now. Our coverage will continue on CBS News 24/7, your local news, and then tonight on the CBS Evening News. We will hear from the president in just a couple hours from now. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Nora O'Donnell in Washington.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lindsay Reiser. You've been watching a CBS News special report. A jury has found the president's son, Hunter Biden, guilty on all 3 charges in his federal gun trial. The charges against the president's son include falsifying statements in order to obtain a firearm and firearm possession by an unlawful drug user or addict. He could face up to 25 years in prison for his crimes. We have team coverage following all of this. Let's first bring in CBS News Homeland Security and Justice reporter Nicole Skanga. She's at the courthouse in Wilmington, Delaware. So, Nicole, tell us about the moment inside when that verdict was read, who was there today, what we should know about this verdict.
Yeah, absolutely, Lindsay. Good to be with you. I'm standing outside the courthouse in Wilmington now, and inside the courtroom, members of the Biden family surrounding Hunter Biden as that verdict was read. The First Lady was in the courthouse, but not the courtroom. She had not yet made it back in time. And just moments ago, we saw members of the First family exiting through courthouse doors. And it's remarkable just the security scene that played out here in Wilmington as that all went down. I probably counted close to a dozen federal agents and officers, including officers with canines, sweeping this scene, ensuring the safety and security of Hunter Biden as he left. Certainly law enforcement outnumbering protesters here today, exercising their First Amendment, and we've seen a few of them. But obviously this verdict bringing to a close a very painful chapter in the Biden family history and a very painful trial, quite frankly.
Are we expecting to hear from anyone soon? I mean, from your vantage point, can you see whether any microphones are set up?
There is an area with microphones. It is possible that we could hear from lawyers for both Hunter Biden and for the government special counsel David Weiss. Momentarily, we've not yet heard any news of that. We did see Hunter leave with First Lady Jill Biden, not likely to make any remarks at this time. And as you heard, earlier on our special report, President Biden set to make some remarks later today. He's actually at a firearms safety event, hosting one at the White House back in Washington, D.C. But as of now, we are in a holding pattern.
Okay, Nicole, flag us something develops. Let's bring in CBS News legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor Jessica Levinson. Jessica, first, your reaction to this and what happens now?
Well, my reaction is that a quick verdict, as we had talked about, is usually good for the prosecution, even though this is the type of case that is not typically brought as a standalone charge. The prosecution did have a lot of evidence here. I mean, the questions were fairly straightforward in the sense that we're looking at these federal forms. We're asking ourselves whether or not Hunter Biden lied when he said, no, I'm not a drug addict, and therefore I can purchase this gun, and whether or not he violated the federal law that says you can't possess a gun if you are a known drug user, an illegal drug user. And the defense, I think, did as well as they possibly could have, trying to place reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury, trying to say there's this question about whether or not Hunter Biden knew that he was a drug addict at the time, understood that at that moment he was an addict. What happens next is obviously there will be a lot of filings before this particular judge leading up to sentencing, but then we can also expect appeals. As we've been hearing about this morning and talking about, I think one of the most interesting grounds for appeal is really the Second Amendment argument, where he would argue, and has argued unsuccessfully so far, that under the current Supreme Court's reading of the Second Amendment, the law that he was tried under is not constitutional. This would obviously be something that, as a political matter, President Biden would not embrace because he's in favor of more restrictive gun control measures. But as a legal matter for his son's case, I think that is an argument that we will see come up again. And I do think it's a real argument.
Jessica, before we let you go, I want to ask you one more thing. How rare are cases like this to be brought?
So rare in the sense that this is not a charge that is unheard of, but it is a charge that is rare as a, again, standalone charge. And Hunter Biden obviously wanted to avoid this moment. He is facing prison time. I don't think that he will face the maximum of 25 years. I don't think the prosecution's going to ask for the maximum of 25 years, but I think that he is facing time behind federal prison bars. And how rare is this? Again, I haven't canvassed the nation statistically in terms of how often does this particular charge show up as a standalone, but it's not typical. That doesn't mean there's something illegitimate about the verdict. It just means that it's not typical.
Okay, Jessica, thank you. I want to bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarlane. He's been covering this trial for us. He's outside the courthouse in Wilmington, Delaware, along with CBS News reporter Erica Brown. Erica, I want to go with you first. You were inside. What was Hunter Biden's reaction and the reaction, if any, of the rest of the courtroom?
Well, Hunter Biden was focused as this verdict came down. It was read by a courtroom deputy, not the jury foreperson, not another member of the jury. As they filed in, he was standing up, his arms and hands crossed in front of them. As it was read by the courtroom deputy, he and his attorneys were seated. He was focused. He was looking straight ahead. He exhibited hardly any emotion. After they read off each guilty verdict, Hunter Biden to his left and his right, greeting each one of his attorneys, hugging them, thanking them, and then on the way out, kissing and hugging his wife, Melissa Cohen Biden.
Scott, I have a few questions for you about this case, but first I just want you to help us understand how significant this moment is. This is the first time charges have been brought against the child of a sitting U.S. president, a president who's running for re-election. What's the significance of this moment?
Well, not only is this the first time a sitting president's child has been convicted in a criminal trial or even brought to a federal criminal trial, but the sentencing timing here seems quite striking. The judge in this case estimated it to be about 120 days until they go to sentencing, and some back of the paper math will show you that's mid-October. That's within weeks of the election. And if he is sentenced to prison time, likely he'd be given a report date. That's 30 days or so after sentencing. That's between Election Day and the end of the presidential term. None of this is happening in a vacuum, and the president's son is now set to be sentenced for a criminal case, and potentially right there on the eve of an election. I'll also note this singular, visceral family tragedy we watched play out right there in the courtroom, with the First Lady of the United States in the front row, with Hunter Biden's family and his current wife in the front row. We all watched his ex-wife testify about the pain of his drug addiction, his own daughter testify about the pain of his drug addiction, then his late brother's widow, a woman with whom he also had a romantic relationship, testify about his addiction, her addiction, both of which were generated by Beau Biden's death, and then her throwing that gun that is pivotal to this case away in a grocery store dumpster. This was an Orwellian tragedy that we watched play out over 7 days in a courtroom here.
Before we let both of you go, Scott, this is also not the end of Hunter Biden's legal troubles. He faces a tax case out of California. What can you tell us about that?
Oh, by the way, the same special counsel, David Weiss, has got charges involving taxes in the federal court system in California. That trial is likely in September, so that happens too before sentencing in this case. The same special counsel who brought this case is bringing that one. It's also in the federal system. Hunter Biden now has growing legal problems after this conviction.
Scott and Erica, thank you. CBS News political correspondent Caitlin Huey Burns is at the White House. Caitlin, first I want to ask you, the president, he has said he has ruled out a pardon for his son. That was prior to the conviction. What can you tell us about those comments and whether you are hearing from any of your sources about whether the door is open for any other future actions?
Hi, Lindsay. Good to see you. Well, we know the president is here at the White House today, and you know, I can't help but note the irony that later today he's expected to go to a hotel in Washington for an Everytown gun safety event where he is supposed to tout the administration's efforts to curb gun violence. And this, of course, comes as his son is now convicted on gun charges. I should also note that we have not heard from the president yet today or his campaign. But at the beginning of this trial, he did issue a statement in which he noted his love for his son. He said, "I am the president, but I am also a dad." He said, "As president, I don't and I won't comment on pending federal cases, but as a dad, I have boundless love for my son, confidence in him, and respect for his strength." I should also note that President Biden expressed confidence in and support of the U.S. justice system after the conviction, the felony conviction of his political rival, Donald Trump, in that criminal case in New York. After that conviction came down, Biden said at the time, "This is how the American system of justice works." He said it's reckless, it's dangerous, and it's irresponsible for anyone to say it was rigged just because they don't like the verdict. The American justice system, he said, is literally the cornerstone of America. So that gives you a sense of his view of the U.S. justice system. When it came, of course, to Donald Trump, we expect that view to hold. But again, we are waiting specific comments from the White House, from the president on this news of the verdict regarding his son, Hunter.
Okay, we will be staying tuned. Caitlin Huey-Burns, thank you so much. Our thanks also to Nicole Skanga, to Scott McFarland, Erica Brown, Jessica Levinson, Caitlin as well. We are, of course, going to have continuing coverage of this at the top of our next hour on CBS News 24/7. Hunter Biden, the president's son, convicted on all 3 counts in his federal gun trial. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News 24/7.
Coming up, our series. Wait a minute. Tom, is that you working the camera?
Keep leaning out of your close-up.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
I had progressively fallen deeper into the world of online sports betting.
The risk is the rush.
What do you think is driving the spike in popularity?
I think it's legality.
If it's legal, I'm going to use it. There are ways to bet when you are 18.
We've created an epidemic of child gambling.
You can't walk into a male dormitory in a college campus without sports betting happening.
It's America's most neglected problem.
I used sports betting as a way to escape, when in reality, I'm choosing self-destruction. Whatever I had left, it was gone.
The purpose of the industry is to get you to play to extinction. And that means until all your money is gone.
Go to the ends of the earth. Reach for the stars.
Yeah, I just took off. That kind of thing.
Oh, that's pretty good. Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
That Desired Farm is a wonderful place to raise children, and it still is.
Promises broken.
Black Americans have been the target of racism and discrimination pretty much from the time they acquired ownership in the land.
Costing black farmers hundreds of billions in generational wealth.
They did everything to make sure we were run off that land.
But communities are uniting to continue the fight.
Collective ownership is powerful.
To keep their land and their dreams alive.
To watch my children play on land that we own means everything.
So land is power.
Most definitely.
40 Acres and a Mule, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
People with developmental disabilities were once sequestered by the hundreds of thousands in institutions.
Many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower.
Disability activists have since torn down barriers blocking them from living at home or in the community.
We conclude that Title II of the ADA requires states to provide community-based treatment for persons with mental disabilities.
But of the 16,000 people who remain in state-operated institutions, half are in 5 states, and Illinois is one of them.
I don't want to live in the institution. It makes me feel discriminated against.
Do you think there are people living in institutions in Illinois that don't need to be living there?
Yeah, because they're proving it as soon as they get out.
I'm John Dickerson. Join me for the Daily Report, weekdays on CBS News 24/7.
A CBS News investigation. People looking for love, finding their life savings gone.
This could happen to anybody.
And sometimes losing their lives. Anything for love. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lindsay Reiser. We continue to follow breaking news from Wilmington, Delaware, where a jury has found the president's son, Hunter Biden, guilty on all 3 charges in his federal gun trial. The charges against the president's son include falsifying statements in order to obtain a firearm and firearm possession by an unlawful drug user or addict. He could face up to 25 years in prison for his crimes. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland has been covering this trial for us. He's outside the courthouse in Wilmington, Delaware, along with all the people you see on your screen now. We have team coverage on all of this. Erica Brown is also next to him. Erica, let's talk to you first because the verdict came down. You ran out. What can you tell us about that moment?
Yeah, so as the verdict came down, as jurors were actually filing into the courtroom first, Hunter Biden was standing at the defense table with both of his attorneys, his arms folded in front of him, his hands crossed. And then the courtroom deputy is the one who actually delivered the verdict, not the jury foreperson, not another member of the jury. So as that verdict was delivered, he was seated at the defense table, looking straight ahead at the courtroom deputy as he read off guilty, guilty, guilty for each count. He exhibited very little emotion. We could not tell what he was thinking based on his facial expressions. He was relatively stoic, but he did acknowledge both of his attorneys on each of his sides, Abby Lowell, David Kalansky, hugging them both. And then as the jury exited the courtroom, it was a very brief process. As they exited the courtroom, he embraced and hugged his wife, Melissa Cohen Biden, at the end.
Scott McFarland, by the numbers, we had 6 days of trial, 3 hours roughly of closing arguments, 3 hours of deliberation. You also, of course, covered a preview of this trial for CBS News before it began, and you spoke to former prosecutor Tom Dupree, and he said this was going to be a case in which some of the most personal, most private details in one of the darkest times of Hunter Biden's life would be laid to bear. And we did see that. What is your characterization of the trial and now his conviction?
Yeah, the sense we got going in is this could be a humiliating trial for Hunter Biden. We may have underestimated the family pain and humiliation that this 6-day trial unearthed and exposed. The witnesses for the prosecution, in addition to Hunter Biden's own words from the audio version of his memoirs that was played for the jury, in which he describes his descent into crack cocaine addiction, included his ex-wife, who talked about finding that crack pipe in 2015 in their Washington, D.C. home. It involved his former girlfriend from California who said he frequently took drugs in or near her presence. And then the widow of his late brother, Beau Biden, Hallie Biden, a woman with whom Hunter Biden had a romantic relationship during the pivotal moments in time for this case in October 2018, describing his drug use and the broken relationships, the fractures because of his drug use. All of this was so personal, so cutting, so visceral. That was laid out for people to watch and see and hear about. And in the front row throughout were members of his family, his current wife. For most of this trial, the First Lady of the United States. Everything happened here was an extended humiliation for Hunter Biden that was capped off by being convicted of 3 felony counts.
Scott and Erica, thank you. I want to bring in former prosecutor Rebecca Roife. Rebecca, not to quote Tom Dupree again, but he had said in the CBS News special report immediately after this verdict that this case was a prosecutor's dream. Do you agree?
I think the case was really strong. I think one thing that we really need to focus on here is while this is a conviction of Hunter Biden and, as Scott was saying, humiliation, it is also a vindication of the criminal justice system here in America. This is a criminal justice system under a president who is a Democrat with an attorney general who has sworn that the Department of Justice is independent. It has brought several indictments against the former president, but it also brought this case through to a conviction, and that is significant here. The contrast between Biden's conduct and what he has said about his son, expressing love, but also faith in the outcome, versus the former president, who not only in his own indictments has repeatedly cast a shadow over the criminal justice system and delegitimized it, but also during the prosecutions of allies during his administration, he, in many ways appeared publicly to delegitimize those cases, called them rigged. So we have some real contrasts, I think, and at the bottom of line of this, we have a criminal justice system that is intact and is functioning.
Well, Rebecca, hang out for us because you just teed up CBS News political correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns, who's at the White House. Caitlin, we have a statement from President Joe Biden. What did he say?
Yes, Lindsay, we're just getting the statement from the White House. He said, as I said last week, I am the president, but I am also a dad. Jill and I love our son, and we are so proud of the man he is today. So many families who have loved ones battle addiction understand the feeling of pride, seeing someone you love come out on the other side, and being so strong and resilient in recovery. And this part is notable, Lindsay. He said, as I also said last week, I will accept the outcome of this case and will continue to respect the judicial process as Hunter considers an appeal. He goes on to say that he and his wife, the First Lady Jill Biden, will always be there for their son and the rest of the family, and nothing will ever change that. So as we were saying before this statement came out, after the Trump verdict, he expressed confidence in and support of the U.S. justice system. Today, maintaining that confidence in and support of the U.S. justice system as his own son was found guilty on gun charges. I should also note, Lindsay, that while we have this paper statement from the president, we are also expected to see him later today in just a couple of hours. He's expected to address the Everytown gun safety event here in Washington to talk about his administration's efforts to curb gun violence. Remember, gun reform has been a big priority and announced achievement of this administration, especially the effort to strengthen background checks. So that is notable that he is speaking on that subject today as his son is now found guilty on those gun charges.
Caitlin Huey-Burns, thank you so much. I want to bring in now Robert Legary, CBS News Justice Department reporter. Robert, if you can, bring us back to the impetus of this case, the special counsel, why we're here in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks for having me. So we'll have to go back to the Trump administration, actually, when U.S. Attorney for Delaware David Weiss, who's now the special counsel, launched the investigation into the president's son. David Weiss was kept on by Merrick Garland at the Justice Department as U.S. Attorney in Delaware to continue this investigation. Usually, when there is a transition in presidents, what happens is the U.S. attorneys in the offices throughout the country are then replaced by those who are picked by the elected president. Here in Delaware, President Biden and Merrick Garland opted to keep David Weiss in that role. The investigation continued, and Merrick Garland subsequently appointed David Weiss special counsel at Weiss's request. Now, the special counsel and the president's son's legal team reached a tentative deal last year where he would enter into a deferred prosecution agreement on the gun charge that he was now convicted of, and then plead guilty to tax charges out in California. What happened today was the result of those talks breaking down, in which it seemed as though Weiss's prosecutors and the defense team disagreed on whether or not this would end all investigations into Hunter Biden at all, or this would just resolve the issues that were before them. The judge who oversaw this case, Judge Noreika, was the one who said that it seemed like the parties disagreed on the outlines of the plea deal and sent them back to the drawing board. Charges were then filed in Delaware and later in California. And this is not the only federal prosecution that Weiss is bringing against the president's son. Hunter also faces charges in California, which he's accused of reneging on and not paying over $1 million in taxes.
Do we expect to hear from anyone at the DOJ today, either AG Merrick Garland or special counsel?
So the Attorney General appointed the special counsel to overview this and to oversee this investigation. He operates independently of the Attorney General. The Justice Department is referring us to the special counsel, and we expect to potentially hear something from Weiss and his team in the coming hours.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rob Legary.
Thanks.
Let's bring in CBS News legal contributor and Loyola Law professor Jessica Levinson. Jessica, can we expect an appeal? What will that look like?
We can expect an appeal. That's not unusual. Every criminal defendant virtually says, I will appeal. And I think one of the most interesting topics on appeal or aspects of the appeal will be the idea that this charge is actually not constitutional under the Second Amendment. This is an argument that Hunter Biden previously unsuccessfully brought up, where he said, I'm looking at the charge, I'm looking at the federal law that says somebody who's a known drug user cannot possess a gun. That's what he's charged under, essentially. And he's saying that would fly in the face of the current conservative Supreme Court's reading of the Second Amendment. This, of course, has irony attached to it because his father is a Democratic president who's pushing for more restrictive gun control, meaning allowing states and the federal government and localities to implement more gun control measures. We heard from Caitlin Huey Burns that the former president is going to be attending an event tonight meant to support people who want to see more gun control measures, the Everytown event. And his son's appeal, I think, in at least part, will rely on this current Supreme Court's conservative reading of the Second Amendment, which says you have to look at the history and tradition of our country in order to uphold any gun control restrictions. Now, I don't know if this will be successful, but I think it's the most interesting argument on appeal.
And Jessica, last question to you quickly. We don't have a firm sentencing date, 120 days estimated. We heard Tom Dupree tell Nora that he does expect there to be jail time in this, but on the lower end, maybe 1 or 2 years. What are your thoughts?
The same. I think that makes all the sense in the world. I do not think that we are going to see a quarter century. That's the maximum here, 25 years. I don't think the prosecution is going to ask for that, particularly given how this case was brought, who Hunter Biden is. And I don't mean the president's son. I mean a first-time offender. And I don't think that this is a case that cries out for the maximum. This is, however, a case where I think you absolutely could see something on the range of 1 to 2 years. And that is part of the reason why Hunter Biden really wanted that plea deal to stay together. We just heard Robert Laguerre talk about why that plea deal fell apart. And this is the somewhat predictable consequence of that.
Jessica Levinson, we so appreciate you. Thank you. And let's go ahead and end where we began with Scott McFarland and Erica Brown. We've been talking about this for about 10 minutes. Final thoughts to you, Scott, and then Erica.
Not only did we have history with the first ever criminal conviction of a sitting president's son, we had played out for the world here an ugly family story of addiction and what it does to families, even close-knit families. The tragedy that impacted Hunter Biden that led to this criminal case and this criminal conviction is a type of tragedy shared by so many Americans. The pains of addiction. And Erica, you watched it in the courtroom. You saw it on the faces of people there.
That's right. And even though this was played out in public for the jurors and also for the media to report, there were still members of Hunter Biden's family that every day packed that first courtroom row right behind him, sitting shoulder to shoulder, supporting him during those breaks when the jury wasn't in the room, hugging him, embracing him, showing their support every day with their presence. So much so because they were sitting in a direct line of view for jurors, federal prosecutors at the very beginning of their closing statements, reminding jurors that the people sitting in the gallery were not evidence, that they should not take that into consideration when they are deliberating. But First Lady Jill Biden there almost every day. Hunter Biden's sister, Ashley Biden, Valerie Biden Owens, James Biden, his wife, Melissa Cohen Biden, all seated there in a show of support.
Scott McFarland, Erica Brown, Robert Laguerre, Jessica Levinson, Rebecca Boyfie, and Caitlin Huey Burns, thank you so much for our special coverage here. We do appreciate it. And we do have much more news still ahead on CBS News 24/7, including 4 Americans recovering from a stabbing attack in China, what we're learning about the victims and the suspect. Plus, House Republicans are looking to hold Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress. We'll discuss where those efforts stand. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News 24/7.
Coming up, our series. Wait a minute. Tom, is that you working the camera?
Keep leaning out of your close-up.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
I had progressively fallen deeper into the world of online sports betting.
The risk is the rush.
What do you think is driving the spike in popularity?
I think it's legality.